Anything else? Yes.
For now, just continue to pray for my dad. Of course, as I said, unfortunately, I don't think he's saved, but I guess he's in his late 90s and his brain has shrunk, and the doctors don't think he'll get any better. And last I heard, he was in some hospital in Milwaukee, and I don't know where anything.
Okay. Okay, anything else? In case you're wondering why Sunday school is so gutted this morning, there are a whole bunch of people over there. I think at least 8 adults going through the new members class for the next couple of weeks. And of course, Sunday school teachers and little kids and so on. So we're glad you're here. During quarantine, I had to preach the empty pews, so this is much better. Any other special requests? Okay, Larry, would you lead us in prayer?
Father in heaven, thank you for a beautiful day, another day that you've given us. Thank you for the opportunity to learn more of your truth through Elijah's example. Lord, we want to lift up Elena to you, and thank you for getting her through the surgery successfully. Lord, we would ask for your blessings upon her recovery. For Rhonda's dad, who's going through some serious health issues. Lord, we pray that you would soften those, and that, Lord, that his heart would be, soil of his heart would be rendered to a turning to you, and through your mercy and grace, Lord, that he would find salvation. Lord, we pray for Pastor Jim this morning. Ask that you would work in him and through him, and pray all this in your name.
Thank you. Okay, if you will turn to 1 Kings chapter 19, and there are outlines in the back if you didn't pick one up on your way in. A lot of ground to cover this morning. Hopefully we can get through the whole thing. I'm going to skip some material today, but it's purposely, and it's not like we're not going to come back to it or haven't already covered some of it. But what I want to do is concentrate on the title, The Mantle of Elijah. And so that will be, that's why we're skipping from 1 Kings 19 over to later on 2 Kings 2 to complete the transfer of the mantle. So just kind of, we've been working our way, if you've been here with us in Sunday school for the past couple of months, when I get the opportunity to preach in Sunday school, or teach in Sunday school, we've been going through the life of Elijah. And remember the juniper tree. That's earlier in chapter 19. And somebody tell me, what was the source of Elijah's discouragement? What was his, if you will, complaint? So here I've done all this for the Lord. I've put my life on the line, literally. And now Jezebel has threatened to take my life, and I am the only one. Do you ever feel like you were the only one in some certain situations? Anybody here ever spent, this is a rhetorical question, don't raise your hand. Anybody here spent any time under the juniper tree? I camped out there on a number of occasions. But God here, remember how God reassured Elijah he hadn't forgotten him. And we'll look at that in just a minute, but I want to digress just a little bit again. The first session we had about Elijah was his pronouncement to Ahab, and then God whisked him off in the wilderness to be fed by what? Ravens, morning and night. For we don't know how long until the brook dried up, which was his source of water. Then God sent him off to Zarephath to be fed by whom? A widow, and what kind of a widow? Poor, almost ready to starve to death. And then under the juniper tree, one way that God encourages Elijah is he's now being fed by whom? An angel. So, from ravens to a starving widow to an angel. God sends an angel to minister to Elijah. And now, the time of Elijah's major life's ministry is coming to an end. And so, it's time, and God knows it's time, and you can tell from Elijah that he's pretty well aware that the time has come. And so God has instructed him to anoint Hazael, the king over Syria, Jehu to be the new king over Israel, and then Elisha as his own successor. But God is not through with him yet. And we see that as we read through the next 4, maybe 5 chapters. We see that God is not through with Elijah yet. And so here we see the beginning of the transfer of leadership. It doesn't actually take place until 2 Kings chapter 2, and Lord willing, we'll get there in just a few minutes. This transfer of leadership has become commonly known as the passing of the mantle. When our son assumed the senior pastorate of the church in Indianapolis, the Lord gave me the privilege of preaching the charge to the new pastor, and I used the symbol of the passing of the mantle from Elijah to Elisha. And his predecessor had pastored for 40 years in that church. It's not easy to follow up a man who has pastored for 40 years, and a very godly man, and known pretty much nationwide. So this transfer of leadership has become known as the passing of the mantle. Was there anything supernatural about the mantle? Does anybody else's version, I should have checked this, use a different word for mantle? Anybody? Cloak. Okay. So that's what it is. It's just a simple cloak. It was a garment that everybody would have probably owned one if they were able, even clothing back then was very valuable. And so just a simple cloak. So there was nothing supernatural, nothing remarkable about the cloak. It was what it represented that makes it so prominent in our text. And so that's what I want to emphasize this morning. So if you picked up an outline, there's some on the back there if you didn't get one. Roman numeral 1 is the acceptance of the mantle. The acceptance of the mantle. And we see that in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 19 through 21. And so he departed thence and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, Let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow thee. And he said unto him, Go back again, for what have I done unto thee? And he returned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slew them and boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen and gave unto the people, and they did eat. Then he arose and went after Elijah and ministered unto him. The acceptance of the mantle. First of all, notice that it was unexpected. What was Elijah doing at the time? No, excuse me, Elisha. Plowing a field. And who would you expect? What kind of person would you expect to be Elijah's, I'm going to get these mixed up all morning, Elijah's successor?
Status, probably, not somebody in a field.
Not just somebody out plowing, right?
Think of a lot of those skill trades, it was someone that took over as like an apprentice. So they're already involved in that, maybe shadowing Elijah, maybe one of those that, wherever that schooler was down in Jericho, wherever that was, that they
Does anybody remember the title of those, what did you call them? Apprentice? Give you a clue, 2 Kings 2:15. Someone would look that up quickly and tell me what the name of that apprentice would be, or those apprentices. Sons of the prophets. That would have been, I mean, that's what they were there for. They were learning from, in this case, Elisha. So you would have expected it to be one of the sons of the prophets. But rather than a gifted theologian or a trained apprentice, God chose a godly farmer. Which brings out the point that God's sovereign choice often baffles us. When I sensed God calling me into the ministry, to my mind, that did not make any sense at all. I had a super bad case of stage fright, which I've never really gotten over. Tongue-tied. Just in my mind, just totally unqualified. All my life I said there's one thing I would never be, and that was a teacher. And preacher was even way distant from my mind, didn't even cross my mind. God's sovereign choice often baffles us. Humorous story I heard years ago. A farmer comes up to his pastor and says, God's called me to preach. And he said, how do you know? He says, well, I was out plowing to plant beans, and I saw this PC in the clouds, and it means preach Christ. And the pastor, being wise and discerning, said, no, that means plant corn. Sorry. Back to our outline. So God's sovereign choice often baffles us, yet we can see something of Elisha's character. When I say Elijah, I probably mean Elisha, and bear with me. Something of his character, he was diligent. Now, here's something interesting. There were 12 yoke of oxen, and Elisha, got it right that time, was plowing with the 12th yoke. Did you ever picture in your mind and wonder why Elisha would line up 12 oxen to plow? That ever cross anybody's mind? Is there a better explanation for why he's plowing with 12 yoke of oxen? The clue is that Elijah is with the 12th. There's 11 other servants with the other 11 yoke of oxen, which would indicate that Elisha is a man of means, a man of wealth. So, when we think farmer, we think of somebody, especially in Bible days, somebody that's just working and working and working just to get by. I think of my own ancestors. That was the case. Everything was done by hand or with horses or oxen. And so indicates a man of substance and also with a large farm. Otherwise, just one yoke of oxen would have been good enough. So he's a man, we see, as we read about this, he was humble, he was industrious, and he was just doing what he was supposed to do. And probably the last thing he must have expected was to be Elijah's successor. How many people in Israel, by the way, know about Elijah? Everybody. Remember Mount Carmel? All Israel was gathered. Everybody knew about Elijah. Anybody here think, well, I think I'll volunteer to be Maranatha's next president? Probably the last thing he expected. It was unexpected. In verse 20, we see that it was understood. He left his oxen, ran after Elijah, said, let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, then I will follow thee. And he said unto him, go back again, for what have I done to thee? So it was understood. He did not ask Elijah, why did you do that? He understood the symbolism of Elijah casting his mantle on Elisha. He understood the significance. He also understood that there would be a price to be paid. because he knew about Elijah's life. He knew that there would be heavy responsibility. He knew that there would be massive opposition. And he knew that there would be extreme self-denial. Which leads me to say, pray for your pastor. Same thing. Heavy responsibility, opposition, self-denial. It also meant leaving all that he had, leaving home, all that was familiar. And so we see another aspect of Elisha's character. Not only was he diligent, he was devoted. He left his oxen in the field, but he made one request, and that is to kiss my father and my mother. Anybody think of a New Testament incident that's similar to that? Let me first go. Becky?
Bury my father.
Yeah. And what was wrong with that?
My father wasn't dead.
His father wasn't dead yet, so don't get any ideas. He was saying, okay, I'll follow you, but let me first of all wait till my dad dies and bury him, and then I'll follow you. Not the same thing here. He knew he was leaving, and he knew he may never return, and he wanted only to give a proper farewell to his parents. And so notice Elijah's unusual reply. He says this, "What have I done to thee?" David, what does your version say there? Verse 20. Last phrase.
What have I done to you?
Yeah, same thing. How do we understand that? You know, I puzzled over that. What did Elijah mean? And I think the emphasis should be on the word I. Because Elijah is not the one who called Elisha. It was God. Elisha was just doing what God had already instructed him to do, to appoint Elisha as his successor, right? So God was the one that called Elisha, just like he called Elijah. And so I think what Elijah is saying here is, you don't need permission from me. Between you and God. What have I done to you? Nothing. God's the one. So it was unexpected, it was understood, but see, it was unquestioned in verse 21. He returned back from him, took the yoke of oxen, slew them, boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen, gave to the people. They did eat. Then he arose and went after Elijah and ministered unto him. He truly burned his bridges behind him, didn't he? Remember Moses' response when God called him? Remember? Can't talk. What else? Here am I, Lord, send my brother. How about Jonah? What was his response when God called him? Opposite direction. In Elisha's case, no reluctance, no bargaining. He made a complete break with his past. And so we see a final aspect of his character. Not only was he diligent and devoted, he was dedicated. He followed Elijah and became his servant, his intern. That brings us to Roman numeral 2, and that is the acquisition of the mantle. And for that, we have to turn over to 2 Kings chapter 2. A is Elisha's resolve in verses 1 through 8. And what I want you to notice here is that 10 years have passed since Elisha was chosen. What do you suppose was taking place in those 10 years? Yeah. Called preach is called prepare. So 10 years have passed. In chapter 21, we read about the vineyard, Naboth's vineyard, remember that? Chapter 22 speaks of the defeat and death of Ahab and Jezebel, just as Elijah had foretold. And then their son, Ahaziah, reigned for 2 years, so in the interim here. Then in chapter 1 is the incident where the 50s and their leader, twice 102 soldiers, are consumed, and Ahaziah died. And so these things all take place in the interlude from the casting of the mantle to the acceptance of the mantle. 10 years have passed, and these incidents have taken place. So now the time for Elijah's departure is near. Verse 1, and it came to pass when the Lord would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. I want to take some time to point out what I believe is the significance of these cities, which we would just totally gloss over, and I did too until a scholar who is far more brilliant and observant than me pointed this out. They are presently in Gilgal. Interestingly, Gilgal was the first encampment in the Promised Land after the children of Israel passed over the Jordan. 12 stones were removed from the dry bed of Jordan, set up as a memorial. And so Gilgal is a picture of commitment to the new life. And it's a picture of conversion, new life, conversion, crossing over the Jordan. All of that, and we don't have time to develop that. That really should be a sermon in itself, this series right here, but just kind of give you an idea. So Gilgal pictures commitment to a new life. It pictures conversion. And then in verses 2 and 3, God calls Elijah to Bethel. Does anybody know what the word Bethel means in English? Yes, house of God. And remember the incident of Jacob there. That's where Jacob met God when he fled from Esau. Remember that story? It's also the place where Abraham's covenant was confirmed. So Bethel is symbolic of the place of consecration. Now, Elijah requested Elisha to stay in Gilgal. He says, I pray thee, or please stay. Back in verse 2, tarry here, I pray thee, stay here. That could have been a test of Elisha's commitment, or it could have been Elijah's effort to spare Elisha from seeing him leave. I lean toward more it being a test of Elisha's commitment, but Elisha insists on accompanying him. And then in verses 4 and 5, Elijah is called to Jericho. While Gilgal speaks of conversion and Bethel speaks of consecration, Jericho speaks of conflict, the place of spiritual warfare. And so the same process is repeated. Stay here. Nope, I'm following you. Then, in verses 6 through 8, Elijah is called to Jordan. And Jordan is a place of conquest, the place of victory. The same process takes place. Stay here. Nope, I'm going with you. So verse 6, and Elijah said unto him, tarry, I pray thee here, for the Lord hath sent me to Jordan. And he said, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. And they two went on. And here they are, 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood to view afar off, and they two stood by Jordan. And Elijah took his mantle and wrapped it together and smote the waters, and they were divided hither and thither, so that they too went over on dry ground. So once again, the Jordan River is parted, a demonstration that God's power resided in his man, Elijah. So the mantle was symbolic of Elisha's commission. And possibly this is Elisha's first exposure to that power, that powerful use of that mantle. We don't read of anything, could have, but I think probably. So then B, we see Elisha's request in verses 9 and 10. It came to pass when they were gone over that Elijah said unto Elisha, Ask what I shall do for thee before I be taken away from thee. And Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And he said, Thou hast asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if thou see me, when I am taken from thee, it shall be so unto thee, but if not, it shall not be so. So in response to Elijah's offer, this double portion of Elijah's spirit. Now, do you think that was a selfish thing for Elisha to ask? I want a double portion of your spirit. I see some people going like this. What would be the reason why he would want?
Ability, like I'm half the man Elijah is, and I need double what he has.
Never thought of it that way, but that's a good point.
Was the magnitude of the job ahead of him, and so he's like, please equip me for this.
He's going to use that, not for selfish gain. And put together what you two just said, I think they're very good answers. Why he felt like that was going to be something that he really needed. So I believe that this shows a significant aspect of Elisha's heart. Someone has said, they covet wisely and with a noble covetousness, who most desire spiritual gifts to fit them for their vocation. What did Solomon ask for? God said, yeah? What do you want wisdom for? So you get real rich? Yeah. Yeah. We have to rule God's people. Again, humility. So, here's another aspect of the double portion. Does that ring a bell? Anything else in the Bible that talked about double portion?
Double portion.
The firstborn son. Elisha is Elijah's spiritually firstborn son. Double portion. Just kind of, maybe there's no significance there, but I thought it was interesting. And so twice as much as others, because he would need it to be Elijah's successor. And so Elijah's reply, verse 10, it's not mine to give. He could only train Elijah. He could not give Elijah a double portion of the Spirit. And then C is Elijah's, in quotes, rapture, verse 11. And it came to pass as they went on and talked that, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. First part of verse 11, it came to pass as they still went on and talked. What do you think they were talking about? Elijah knows, time's up. Just interesting, kind of speculate what they were talking about. But this time, remember the juniper tree incident, and Elijah, I'm all by myself, and there was a wind, and God was not in the wind. There was a fire, God was not in the fire. This time God is in the wind and the fire. See that in the verse? A chariot of fire, horses of fire, a whirlwind. God is definitely in that, and so Elijah went up. D, Elisha's response, 12 and 13, Elisha saw it and cried, my father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more. And he took hold of his own clothes and rent them in two pieces. He took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and went back and stood by the bank of Jordan. That's the only thing Elijah left behind. So we see in the first part of verse 12, his exclamation of maybe surprise, or at least supplication. He calls out, my father. Is he referring to Elijah, perhaps? Is he referring to God, perhaps? And who are the horsemen? Well, probably angels. What else would they be? So his exclamation of surprise and then his expression of sorrow, there's this great feeling of personal loss. This man that I depended on, think of the disciples after the Lord, told him he wouldn't be with them anymore. And then we see in verse 13 his embracement of servitude. And he returns to Jordan. Roman numeral 3 is the appropriation of the mantle, verses 14 and 15. In verse 14, we see Elisha's assumption. He took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and smote the waters and said, "Where is the Lord God of Elijah?" And when he had also smitten the waters, they parted hither and thither, and Elisha went over. Okay, do you think Elisha was this an expression of doubt? Where's the God of Elijah? Do you think that was an expression of doubt?
Now's your time to show yourself strong.
I agree. I do not believe for a moment. Elisha immediately assumed the vacated position. Stepped right in where Elijah left off. He took up the mantle, he smote the water, expecting some results. And so, where's the Lord God of Elijah? Not an expression of doubt. He is calling on Elijah's God as his own. The same God now as he was then, and with the same results that Elijah experienced. Finally, verse 15, the prophet's acknowledgement. And when the sons of the prophets, which were to view at Jericho, saw him, they said, "The spirit of Elijah doth rest on Elisha." And they came to meet him and bowed themselves to the ground before him. So there's this human acknowledgement of God's call, which is kind of like an ordination in modern day, a human acknowledgement of God's call. So, wow, I've got more time than I thought I would. Maybe I went too fast. But what can we learn? Number one, God chooses people who are already, what do you think? Busy. That's the kind of person God typically calls. And I think Pastor referred to that recently in a sermon and kind of challenged us. Get busy doing what you know God wants you to do. And it's in the process of doing what we're supposed to be doing that God then calls upon us for further service. Something every Christian should deeply, desperately want. Lord, please, how can I serve you? In what capacity? Secondly, God chooses people of all. Anybody gets this when you're a scholar? Who said? Walks. Okay, scholar. God chooses people of all walks to do what he sees fit. It would be interesting to take a survey of people God has called into quote-unquote full-time service and see what they were doing at the time. Number 3, our call to service is from God, not man. I think there are too many people that men have called into the ministry rather than God, and it doesn't work. If it's going to work, it must be from God. 4, we should embrace happily God's call in spite of possible reservations. Five, God only shows us one step at a time. Anybody ever try to take 2 steps at the same time? Larry, would you come up here and, no. You ever tried, I can see some kid trying to do that. God just shows us 1 step at a time, you know. We'd like to know, okay, what's next, what's next? Doesn't happen that way. 6, service begins with a learning, growing time. One of the qualifications of a pastor is not a, starts with an N. I think I heard somebody say it, novice, not a novice. Call to prepare, call to preach, call to prepare. So service begins with a learning, growing time before God puts us into a position of, can I say, leadership? 7, God often tests our level of commitment. Are you really committed to do my will? No matter what. 8, spiritual power to do God's work is of utmost importance. Not persuasive words of man's eloquence, as Paul said. If we're going to be effective in our ministry, no matter what our ministry is, it has to be done through God's power, not through ours. Us won't work. 9, no one is indispensable or irreplaceable in God's work. I really struggled when I sensed God leading me away from Beloit. At the time, I knew he was not only leading me away from Beloit, but he was leading me away from ministry, period, I thought, because of my health. And so we were at Pastor's Family Camp, and I asked Dr. Votter, could we talk? And I asked him for his advice. And it's not like I felt irreplaceable, but my family and I were involved in so many things. Linda was the pianist, choir for the choir and congregational. Half of our family was half of the choir. Sunday school teachers, on and on. And, you know, I expressed that to Dr. Votter, and he said, you know what, Jim, that's not your responsibility. That was the best advice I could have gotten. And God sent, sure enough, a godly man with umpteen talented kids, Dan Sturts, to be my successor. No one is indispensable or irreplaceable in God's work. 10, once we understand God's will, we should act immediately. And as I was going over my notes this morning, I added a number 11. It's not on your verse sheet there, your note sheet there, but it should be on the PowerPoint. Number 11, even after our major ministry, God still uses us. Elijah's major life's ministry was done. But we know, as we read in the succeeding chapters, that God was not through with him yet until we get to chapter 2 of 2 Kings. Okay. 5 minutes early. Wow. Any questions, comments? All right. You have an extra 5 minutes break. You're dismissed.